Albus Dumbledore is one of the pivotal characters of Harry Potter, arguably one of the greatest wizards of all time, and notably the only wizard who Voldemort, the greatest dark wizard, feared. He acts as a mentor figure to Harry, serving as the wise and knowledgeable elder who guides and protects Harry on his path. And in some ways, Dumbledore is a mirror of Voldemort for Death Eaters and the like. Now, I recently spoke in another video about how Voldemort was really mischaracterized in the Harry Potter movies, and unfortunately I think Dumbledore suffers from a lot of the same issues. I similarly believe his character was not done justice and was poorly understood. So what I'll be discussing in this video are the key areas where I feel the movies failed with Dumbledore, why it was done poorly, and why it was done better in the books. If you're interested in hearing a similar analysis for Voldemort and you haven't seen my other video, please go ahead and watch that on my channel. Otherwise, let's get straight into it. So, I believe there are three key areas where the movies failed with Dumbledore. The first is that Dumbledore's magical ability is very understated compared to the books. The second is that Dumbledore's soft power is diminished. The third is that Dumbledore's intelligence seems to be reduced in the movies. Now, all three of these things are actually shown in the first scene we'll be breaking down, although we'll also be covering some additional, more specific examples. But for now, let's get straight into the first scene, which is when Dumbledore discovers the fake Moody for the first time at the end of the Goblet of Fire. So let's go through the movie version of events first, break it down, and then we'll be comparing that against the book and seeing the differences between the two. In the movie scene, just as the fake Moody is about to attack Harry, Dumbledore runs into the room, disarming him with Expelliarmus. He then follows up by physically grappling him in the chair and shouting at him, demanding answers. He comes across as wild and out of control, even shouting at Harry to get away from the trunk. When they open the trunk, Snape is the one who cast the spell to open it, and they advance together in lockstep. Snape then figures out the imposter was drinking Polyjuice Potion and explains it to Dumbledore. The enraged Barty Crouch Jr. then physically lunges for Harry, and Dumbledore physically fends him off while Snape and McGonagall threaten him with their wands. Now, there's a few problems with Dumbledore's depiction in this scene, and it covers all three of the aspects that I just mentioned. Firstly, Dumbledore here does not come across as especially magically powerful. He uses a simple disarming spell that, although it does throw Crouch back, doesn't seem to do much else, and he's forced to physically restrain him as a follow-up afterwards, instead of relying on his wand. Leading on from that, Dumbledore seems angry and confused throughout the entire scene. He strikes me as completely out of his depth, and he seems to only be realizing things at the same time that we are the audience. Doesn't come across as especially powerful or in control of the situation. He appears totally bamboozled and afraid at his loss of control. And finally, the big problem with this scene is that Snape and McGonagall do not look to Dumbledore for direction at any point. They are very proactive themselves, restraining Crouch, then Snape opening the trunk, and then advancing together. Now, if we contrast all this with the books, it couldn't be more different. So now let's go through this chapter in the books and pick out a few key moments in relation to what we're discussing. Read out these quotes and I'll also flash them up on the screen, emphasizing the parts which I think are most important. First quote. The look on Dumbledore's face as he stared down at the unconscious form of Mad-Eye Moody was more terrible than Harry could ever have imagined. There was cold fury in every line of the ancient face. A sense of power radiated from Dumbledore, as though he was giving off burning heat. This quote shows us from Harry's perspective just how powerful Dumbledore is. The wording Rowling uses here is very specific. Dumbledore is described as terrible and frightening. As I said earlier, he's a mirror of how normal wizards perceive Voldemort, and Harry is witnessing for the first time that frightening side of Dumbledore that is presented to and reserved only for evildoers. His power is described viscerally as though he's a burning flame, which conveys a sense of raw elemental force. And this depiction is crucial not only because it demonstrates Dumbledore's strength and power, but also because it underscores the duality of his character. Throughout the series, Dumbledore is mostly portrayed as a benevolent, wise, and almost grandfatherly figure. However, this scene reveals the depth of his strength and the fierceness of his commitment to justice. It is a stark reminder that Dumbledore, despite his calm exterior, possesses a formidable power that he is willing to unleash when necessary. This is a fitting description of the wizard who is described as the only person who Voldemort feared. Also, Crouch is blasted unconscious by a single spell from Dumbledore, and he accomplishes this without any apparent physical effort, relying solely on his magic. This further reinforces the idea that I discussed in my Voldemort video. The most powerful wizard of all time should not need to resort to physical force. Instead, he should be able to depend entirely on his magical prowess. Then, leading on from that, And unlike the movie scene, Dumbledore still gives the impression of control over the situation. McGonagall and Snape move at the direction of Dumbledore. They're not proactive in this, they're reactive to Dumbledore. Look how the book shows them responding after Dumbledore gives both of them orders. If either Snape or McGonagall found these instructions peculiar, they hid their confusion. Both turned at once and left the office. Use of the words "at once" shows how Snape and McGonagall just snap into action and they don't even question Dumbledore despite the instructions being strange. Dumbledore continues to be proactive throughout the scene. He is the one to open the trunk and then command Harry to throw down his cloak to warn Mad-Eye Moody. Dumbledore himself jumps down to check on him, and Dumbledore is the one to determine that the potion is Polyjuice potion. Dumbledore also already knows that the Polyjuiced imposter is not the real Moody as soon as he enters the room. He doesn't need to demand answers from the imposter. "This is not Alistair Moody," said Dumbledore quietly. "You have never known Alistair Moody. The real Moody would not have removed you from my sight after what happened tonight. The moment he took you, I knew, and I followed." These are key characteristics of Dumbledore, which are consistently emphasized and portrayed throughout the series. He always appears calm and in control, often seeming almost omniscient. This portrayal reinforces his role as both a mentor and a dependable anchor for Harry, as well as the image of a wise and ancient wizard. This is reinforced by his manner of speaking throughout the entire chapter. I'll flash up a few quotes here. "Can you hear me?" Dumbledore asked quietly. "I would like you to tell us," said Dumbledore softly. "You killed your father," Dumbledore said in the same soft voice. In fact, throughout this chapter, Dumbledore uses a combination of quietly and softly a total of 6 times when speaking. He maintains that aura of control and intelligence. He's already aware of what's going on. He leads the interrogation to find out the missing information, and he directs everybody else in the scene. They all move at his command. We can contrast this to the movie version, where, as I mentioned, he seems wild, angry, and afraid. He seems out of his depth. This scene really encapsulates everything that is wrong with Dumbledore's portrayal in the movies. It hits on every aspect that I spoke about, and we see this continued throughout the next 2 movies, sometimes subtly and sometimes less so. For example, when Dumbledore attends Harry's hearing in Order of the Phoenix, in the movie he stands before the Minister, implying a power imbalance between them as he looks up at the Minister's raised seat, and he walks around while he's defending Harry. He also publicly pleads with Fudge, saying, "Cornelius, I implore you to see reason." And when Fudge doesn't listen, he looks frustrated and exasperated. His portrayal here reminds me of a child being summoned to the headmaster's office to be told off, and he completely allows Fudge to control the situation and publicly humiliate him. In the books, he conjures a comfortable chair for himself, despite the Minister trying to offer him a chair, showing how Dumbledore controls the situation and isn't reactive to others. It's almost like he sets the rules of engagement. In the movies, the fact that he's pleading with Fudge and then looks frustrated when he's not listened to gives Fudge the power in the interaction, as Dumbledore is the one coming to him and pleading and Fudge is the one refusing. There are also some additional subtle reactions to Dumbledore which again speak to his soft power in the books. In the books, when he enters the room, we get the following quote. "The members of the Wizengamot were muttering. All eyes were now on Dumbledore. Some looked annoyed, others slightly frightened. 2 elderly witches in the back row, however, raised their hands and waved in welcome." And then again, a bit later on, the Wizengamot was still muttering and fidgeting restlessly. Only when Fudge spoke again did they settle down. In the movies, the reaction of the court isn't really shown, but in the books, it's clear that Dumbledore's presence has a very significant impact on all the members of the court, and they all react in different ways, but the key thing is that they all react. These subtleties being left out of the movie have a subconscious impact on our perception of Dumbledore. We lose these moments where he establishes power and control over the situation and over others. Instead, we get a diminished version of Dumbledore who has to plead with the Minister and is emotionally reactive to things that are happening outside of his control. Now, the final scene that I want to talk about focuses mainly on point 1, Dumbledore's magical ability being understated. And this is the scene where Dumbledore arrives at the Ministry. In the movies, he arrives fairly without ceremony. He walks into the Ministry via Floo powder at the same time as Voldemort, more or less. We don't see reactions from Bellatrix, who is there with him, or really anybody else in the room. When he duels Voldemort, they have a back and forth duel where they're mostly on a level footing, despite the spectacular visuals. In the books, Dumbledore's arrival is much more fleshed out, and we get a lot of little details which speak to his power and how he is perceived by the Death Eaters. We can start with this quote. When the Death Eaters nearest realised Dumbledore was there and yelled to the others, one of the Death Eaters ran for it, scrabbling like a monkey up the stone steps opposite. Dumbledore's spell pulled him back as easily and effortlessly as though he had hooked him with an invisible line. And then another quote, Dumbledore had most of the remaining Death Eaters grouped in the middle of the room. The word choice here is really key. The Death Eater is described as scrabbling like a monkey up the stone steps. He's shown to be running almost in blind terror like an animal from Dumbledore. And Dumbledore's ease at dealing with the Death Eaters is really emphasized, as we see he pulls him back easily and effortlessly, and he single-handedly handles all of the remaining Death Eaters, grouping them in the middle of the room. Then, Bellatrix, while sobbing in fear at having failed Voldemort, still tries twice to warn him about Dumbledore. And again, notice the word choice here. But Master, he is here. He is below. Notice how she doesn't even speak Dumbledore's name, mirroring how people are afraid to use Voldemort's name. The fear from her and the other Death Eaters is palpable in this scene. It's very visceral, and it emphasizes the power gap between them and Dumbledore. Just like with how people were afraid of Voldemort and flee before him, the Death Eaters are terrified of Dumbledore and don't even think about attacking him or fighting back. And when Voldemort and Dumbledore duel, notice again the word choice. It was foolish to come here tonight, Tom, said Dumbledore calmly. By which time I shall be gone and you will be dead, spat Voldemort. We both know there are other ways of destroying a man, Tom, Dumbledore said calmly, continuing to walk towards Voldemort as though he had not a fear in the world, as though nothing had happened to interrupt his stroll up the hall. There is nothing worse than death, Dumbledore, snarled Voldemort. Harry felt scared to see him walking along, undefended, shieldless. Again, J.K. Rowling really takes care to emphasize how calm and in control of the situation Dumbledore is, and this is contrasted with how much angry and emotive Voldemort is, especially considering that Voldemort is normally fairly calm and collected himself. But Dumbledore here rattles Voldemort, breaking through his typical icy shell. And although I said this is mainly around the first point of Dumbledore's magical ability, this can also be seen as tying into the second point of Dumbledore's soft power. He doesn't need to openly state things or openly take actions. It's his presence and his aura which implies absolute control over the situation. At no point does Dumbledore ever come across rattled. He always acts as if he was the one who chose to be there and who knew all along what was happening. In conclusion, Dumbledore is portrayed in the Harry Potter books as a figure of immense magical prowess, calm authority, and strategic intelligence, making him a powerful and respected mentor for Harry. However, the movie adaptations really fail to capture this depth, instead depicting him as more physically aggressive, less composed, and less in control of the people and events happening around him. This portrayal diminishes both his soft power and his intelligence, which are crucial aspects of his character in the books. And like with my Voldemort comparison, it's disappointing to see such an important and beloved character really misunderstood and mischaracterized, and I think it really takes away from the overarching story. Now, with a character like this, I could have spoken for a lot longer on this topic, but if you've listened up to this point, thank you very much for listening. And as always, I'd be really interested to hear what you guys think, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. And if you'd like to hear me talk about any other topics, characters, or stories, please just let me know. Thank you.